Hello, this is Neil Foote. I'm director of the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference, and today's session is Voices from the Pandemic. And we have a very special panel today, including a very special friend of the Mayborn Conference. He's been a speaker, he's been an award winner of the conference, he's a Pulitzer Prize winner. Eli Saslow, welcome back to the Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference.
Thanks so much. I'm thrilled to be here and love what you all do.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you've got an upcoming release of a new book. That's the title of this session: "Voices from the Pandemic: Americans Tell the Stories of Crisis, Courage, and Resilience." The conference this year is looking at some of these issues, as particularly as journalists, as people, as a nation. And yeah, I've been able to kind of come through your book, and you've really captured some wonderful voices from people all around the country. Certainly when the pandemic hit last year, was this top of mind of pulling it together as a book, or did this evolve as you began doing the reporting?
It was really an interesting new challenge for me, honestly. I mean, normally my work for the Washington Post and most of my work as a journalist has been sort of embedded, observed in-person journalism, where if I'm writing about something or writing about someone, I'm going to where they live, and I'm spending 14 hours a day, whatever it might be, sort of shadowing them through their lives. And the reporting is interviewing, of course, that's foundational, but also observing them and hearing dialogue and watching them sort of navigate the challenges, and writing about it using all of those tools. And when the pandemic hit, frankly, it became pretty clear, particularly in those first months, that doing journalism in that sort of embedded way was going to be very challenging. It would be risky for myself, more ethically complicated. It would be really risky for the people that I write about. I couldn't get on a plane and fly someplace, and then embed in somebody's home for a week at a time. I would be putting them potentially at risk. So this kind of began, honestly, from a place of accommodation in some ways of the pandemic. Like how can I still find a way to tell stories that feel intimate and empathetic, and will reveal what's happening in people's lives at this, frankly, historic moment. And one of the things that I started talking about with my editors, was this sort of oral history storytelling. I'd read a few books of oral histories that had stuck with me, and I thought that maybe if I could invest the time in having not just one or two conversations with people, but often spending, in the case of this book, 10, 20 hours on the phone with somebody, I might be able to sort of achieve the same sort of intimacy, that I can when I go and I see people. And also I thought, maybe by putting the story, in people's own words, and by having them be the storytellers, it will create a more direct connection between the storyteller and the person reading the story. And that really was what this project was for me. In some ways, a learning experience, and also, it ended up being kind of sustaining for me during the pandemic. I mean, the pandemic was so much about, all of our isolation, right? Like we were isolated into our own bubbles, our own ideas of how the world works. We just were physically and I think ideologically separated in so many ways. And the work of a journalist gave me the immense privilege, frankly, of being able to reach beyond my own bubble and call people from all over the country in all different walks of life who were dealing with the pandemic in ways that I couldn't imagine inside my own bubble. And I think their courage, but more truthfully, their honesty, like the fact that people still are willing to trust somebody that they've never met, to tell their stories to a journalist, hoping that it will matter, that it will affect somebody. I think that in many ways kind of sustained some of my faith in humanity during a year that was really difficult. I think sometimes to have that kind of faith.
Well, this in the old days, pre-pandemic, we could just walk down the street and hop in a plane and do these interviews. You had to do a lot of sourcing and a lot of conversations to kind of sift through to find these stories. Talk a little bit about that process of, one, identifying potential people to talk to, and how you even began to develop this rapport, again, probably in a setting like this or just on a phone call, to get people to open up to you and have that continuous conversation.
Sure. Yeah, it's a great question. In some ways, actually, parts of it were very similar to my normal reporting process, in that what I sometimes call pre-reporting, like the finding the story that I wanted to tell. It was very similar to how I do it for a longer narrative piece, which involves basically talking to a lot of people to figure out the one person that eventually I'm going to write about. So say, for instance, I came up with the idea that, at a certain point in the pandemic, it was clear that there was a major pressure point around, store clerks, who were then going to be forced to kind of enforce mask mandates that towns and counties were not enforcing. And it became interesting to me that, like, these oftentimes $10 an hour low wage workers, at great risk to themselves, essential workers, were standing behind a counter in a store, and people were coming in unmasked again and again, and they were the ones who had to say, can you put a mask on? And these confrontations were sometimes getting demoralizing, or in the worst cases, violent. So I thought, I would like to hear from somebody about what that's like every single day to be doing that. So that kind of reporting process for me begins with, I want to talk to a bunch of people who are in this situation to learn about it. And it begins with research of what are the states where maybe these mask mandates are running into more conflict. What's the kind of town that I'm looking for? I would join a Facebook group for store clerks working in the pandemic, where a lot of people in the stores were already going to talk about what was happening to them. And through all these places, I begin having conversations with maybe a dozen different people. And those initial conversations might be a half hour, 45 minutes, just to get a sense of what they're dealing with. And in those conversations, I'm also looking for, what's the one person who I want to hear more from, and who's making me really curious, and either in the way they are able to tell their own story, or some of the experiences that they're having, they feel like somebody that I think has something to say to a lot of people. So in this case, in those dozen conversations, one of the people that I talked to was this woman, Laurie Wagner. She worked at a small little store in rural North Carolina. She's a 64-year-old asthmatic woman, terrified of getting this virus, in a place where most people were not wearing masks. And she'd begun the pandemic by putting a sign outside her store that said, please wear a mask to be kind to us. It helps keep us safe. And that hadn't worked. So her signs had gotten more and more severe. Wear a mask. It's the rule. Wear a mask or don't come in. Why aren't you wearing masks? Do you not care about us? And and eventually, over months of this, she had started locking the door of her store, because these conflicts had gotten worse and worse. And she was standing behind the counter with mace, and sort of terrified of the next customer who had come in. So once I started hearing that, I thought, Laurie's the story. I want to hear about what's happening to her, and what's happening in this place in North Carolina that began in this like neighborly way of people appealing to kindness, and now is sort of a community at war with itself. So then I start talking to Laurie kind of nonstop, and for maybe a week, I'm talking to her after her shifts, before her shifts, when she's there at the store. I'm saying, hey, would you mind putting me on FaceTime and just kind of setting me up on the counter so I can see what's happening in the store around you, and I can get a sense for some of this myself. And I'm taking tons of notes from all of those conversations. In the end, I might have 15,000 words of transcription from my conversations with Laurie. And then I'm going through those 15,000 words, and I'm saying, how can I condense, lightly edit, and structure this into, say, a 1,500 or 2,000 word piece, that's going to give people an idea in Laurie's own voice of what it's like to be in her situation.
Yeah, that's fascinating. One of the stories that pops into my mind was and I actually kind of flagged it because I thought it was so poignant. Was this one of Darlene Kravitz, and where you follow her not only when she's just getting COVID, and then you walk us through this whole gut wrenching kind of episode of her condition, getting worse, and worsening along the way, and this whole opening sentence, paragraph where you have, I've hardly moved from this couch in weeks, but right now my heart rate monitor says I'm at 132. That's double my normal. And then you go on to talk to, I have to be getting better, right? I'm active, I'm healthy, I'm only 52. And you go on to craft the narrative of her battling and bring us into this narrative that we We almost got into this numbing effect over the past year of seeing the numbers and the charts of the number of cases and deaths. Reminded me of growing up as a kid in the 60s and seeing the numbers from the Vietnam War that used to be on the network news.
Right.
And I'm sure that's probably one of several stories that just probably just tugged away at your heart. How did you kind of maintain that dialogue and kind of keep the sense of journalists, and we want to get into this probably a little deeper with our other panelists, of this journalists, we have this responsibility to tell that story, but we also are walking this line of being voyeuristic. Are we getting too personal? How much do you tell? How did you balance that with this story of this one woman and the many others that you told?
Yeah, it's such a wonderful question, and is so much at the heart, I think, of what we do, and also like how I think about myself as a journalist, and also a person, and like my small little role in the world, right? And Darlene, I think you're right that sometimes like the numbers of, especially like a pandemic that is ongoing, and in terms of the numbers, is shocking in and of itself, right? To think that 1 in 500 Americans has died of this, it becomes. It can become numbing, but then for me, I think also when we become numb, it's our temptation to sort of turn away, to become less empathetic, we sort of like callous against the things that are going on, and one antidote to that, I think, in my own experience, is to like stare hard into the humanity. And Darlene, who ended up being one of those 1 in 500 people, thinking about like when I reached out to her, I didn't know I was writing about somebody who was in the process of dying. I thought I was maybe going to be doing a story on somebody who it looked like was going to have long COVID, and was going to be struggling with long haul symptoms. As it turned out, over the few weeks that Darlene and I talked, she got worse and worse and worse. And then she was sending me frantic messages from on Facebook from the hospital saying they don't know what's going on with me. Then I was talking to her in her last days, and to her kids who were there, and ultimately to like her son who was having to give his mother CPR, and she was losing her mind, essentially, trying to walk out of the house and in her underwear, and just a family falling apart, right? So that I think sometimes it's really important to think not about the 1 in 500, but about the one, and to look hard at how massively ruthless the toll of this can be for one family. And I think it's another really good, thoughtful question about what that means for us as journalists, right? Like there can be elements of sort of like secondary trauma in this job, and that if we're doing our work in the right way, we're talking to people, I think, who are suffering or in pain, with some degree of frequency. And it's true that can be hard. It can, sometimes after talking on the phone to Darlene for 3 hours, or hearing her son narrate to me what's going on in her house, I feel some degree of just exhaustion or sadness. But the first thing I always try to remind myself is, this is like the for me, these are stories. I or a book. I finish writing about Darlene and her experience, and I get to go back to my own like happier, isolated little bubble, and the circumstances in my own life. So the stories for the people that we write about, they don't end when we leave, for the most part, and the suffering, and the real hardship is always on the end of the people that we write about, and also the true act of courage is always on the end of the people that we write about. They're the ones who decide, I want this story to be told, and I'm willing to be vulnerable for an audience of people that I don't know in a really public way. That's a remarkably courageous thing to do. And so I try to think about that piece of it. And then the greater truth is, the gift of this work for me most of the time is that it gives me so much more than it ever takes out of me. Even those hard conversations with Darlene, and feeling the loss of what her and her family are going through. It's I'm doing that work because it matters to me. It feels purposeful. It feels like at a time in this country where there's a lot of stuff going on that I can't do anything about, I can try to help this one person tell her story in a way that might pierce some people, and that might make them think a little bit differently about this virus and what's going on. And that, that's that's more life giving to me, I guess, than it takes out of me. I get to do work in this job that feels like it matters, even if just to me, and that's a gift in and of itself.
I want to bring into the conversation several of our Mayborn students and graduates, Eli, who had a chance to work on a very special project called the Coronavirus Chronicles, thanks to Professor Mark Donnell. We have Megan Martinez, Rebecca Nahara, and Kate Pazzulli, who wrote some wonderful stories, many much in the same way sent out by their professor to track down these wonderful stories. And Megan, I know you wrote one of the stories that popped out was how you tried to capture some of the sense of what was going on in our school systems here in Denton, in Texas. Talk a little bit about the story that you wrote.
So I actually covered a Catholic school in El Paso, and the principal there, and how the pandemic kind of was hurting an already a school with a lot of that already had a lot of financial struggles and low enrollment, and due to parents losing jobs, online learning, a lot of people left the school, and that principal was trying her best to keep that school open, worrying about, kids wearing masks, having enough teachers, worrying about teachers getting sick, not having substitutes, all because of COVID. And the question at the end was very much there: will the school close within the next year, the next few years, because COVID caused a more rapid decline?
Awesome. I mean, sounds like such worthy and important work, and something that one of the things I think about something like the pandemic, right? And unfortunately, like this is true for pretty much any hard thing that happens in the United States, is that it worsens inequality in almost every way, right? All of the inequity that's baked into this country, and all of the white supremacy that is at the root of so much of what America is and continues to be, unfortunately. It means that people who suffer from things like this, we suffer disproportionately. Anybody who was vulnerable before is much more likely to be more vulnerable after a crisis than people who have the means and the healthcare and everything else to weather it. So I think paying attention to sort of the long legacy of this pandemic, in those ways, in terms of equity in education and healthcare, in who owns property in this country and who doesn't, in housing crises that come, and who it impacts and who's evicted, all those things. That's going to be the thing, I hope, that all of us are reporting on for the next decade, because if and when this pandemic ends, it's the fallout is going to continue to define so much of what America looks like, and I think that starts in many ways in the schools. I actually did in March a sort of similar reporting project where I was this time in person, back on a plane, writing about sort of students, mostly low-income students of color who had sort of disappeared from school systems during the pandemic, because they had to take care of siblings at home. They had to pick up work that their parents could no longer do. People in their households were disproportionately sick. I went to the Indio sort of area in California, where there also a lot of kids had their families had gone back to Mexico for medical care. All these different things had changed, and so there the vice principal, who was sort of in charge of enrollment at the school, would look at his roster of what was supposed to be 1,600 students and would see basically 400 kids out of these 1,600 kids that he couldn't account for. So every Wednesday he would get in his car and he would drive around like the valley, and he would go looking for these kids. He would go to the to sort of like the fruit picking areas, to the trailer parks near school, and knock on doors and say, like, what happened to this kid? Does anybody know where this kid is? Can anybody tell us where this student is? So for a story like that, I go and 3 Wednesdays in a row, I get in the car with Rich Pimentel, the assistant principal at this school, as he goes looking for these kids. And the sad thing is that story is playing out all over the country. So I'm really glad that you covered it. Was it hard to sort of get access into the schools, and were they, how comfortable did they feel about you telling that story? Because sometimes that can be a challenge in the school space.
Right. So I had a connection where I knew somebody who knew the principal there.
Great.
I actually had gone to that school. It was a Catholic school. I don't know if I mentioned that.
Yep.
And she was willing to, and I'd met her before, so she was willing to talk to me. But the only problem was it's hard to get people to admit things that aren't like public knowledge. Like,
Yep.
like, do you think the school is going to close? She kind of goes around it, but basically she's saying yes. Those kinds of things were a little bit difficult to make, those connections, but it was clear that that was a real concern.
Yeah, yeah, that's awesome. Well, and so many times, at least in my own experience, is like like people become more and more honest the more they trust you, right? And the more they know you. So it's like for you, I would imagine, Megan, you had some advantage in that you were connected to the school and the community, and that probably like that facilitated some degree of trust and openness at the beginning, right? But it's like, for me, sometimes I'm stunned. Like the first Wednesday that I spent with Rich, watching him go around and see those students, he was still sort of trying to, he didn't know me, and he was trying to put a good face on things, and he wasn't yet fully comfortable. So he was still trying to sort of say like, we'll find these kids. It's not that bad. It's going to be okay. And then by, the third Wednesday in a row where, now I'd spent 70 hours with him and we were riding around, it was like, what the hell, where are these guys? Like, I don't understand what's happening. People, they get more comfortable being honest with you, right? Like they sometimes reporting does have this weird corollary with like forming new relationships or dating or whatever else, where on the first time that you're with somebody, you never give them the true authentic version of yourself. There's a lot of truth in what you're saying. You're not trying to lie or deceive them, but you kind of are polishing things a little bit, and people can only sustain that for so long. So for me, that's always a reason to report for as much time as possible. Like if I have a week to do a story, I would rather spend 6 days reporting and 1 day writing than like 4 days reporting and 3 days writing, because the material just gets better and better the longer that you're building trust with people. So yeah, it sounds like you did a good job of that there, and had that great head start by already kind of having your hooks into the community a little bit. Thanks for telling me about it.
Diving into the reporting, Kate, you had a couple interesting pieces there. One of which approached someone who really didn't think this COVID stuff was for real. One of the many folks in America who just questioned whether COVID was a hoax or not. Can you talk a little bit about that story?
Yeah, so I did a story on Patrick, who in Denton, everybody knows him as the flat Earth guy. He has his cars have all the shoe polish paint all over, flat Earth, like sea level is level, all of that. Well, once COVID hit, he had signs like COVID equals scam. There is, don't take the shot, vaccines are a hoax, all of that stuff. So I wanted to do a story on him because I wanted to see why he thought the way that he thought. And I had actually had a hard time tracking him down. I mean, he seems like a guy who really wants to get his message out, but right. I had a hard time actually getting contact with him. Once I finally did, I didn't have, a whole lot of time to gain his trust, like what you were talking about. So, but one of what I did in order to kind of facilitate that was when I did the interview in person, I didn't wear a mask because I thought I didn't want to be seen as the other, like immediately. So I didn't wear a mask, and I, shook hands because I knew that's what he wanted to do. And then he actually, he started talking to me pretty quickly about his thoughts on COVID and about why he thought it was a scam. And, we talked for like 3 hours. And in the beginning, it was all very a lot of bravado. He's almost shaking when he's talking about this because Patrick is just, he fell into a YouTube hole about 10 years ago and never came out. So all of the flat earth stuff, all of the whatever, I mean, I figured out that what happened was he had surgery, where he was laid up in bed for about a month or two. And that's basically. So, I mean, at the end of the day, why he thinks the way that he does is because he had an unlucky problem where he had to have surgery and be laid up, and that's where basically all of his ideas on coronavirus come from.
Right.
But it was hard, and I'm interested to hear what you have to say about when you speak to people like that. So like you talked about talking to Darlene and her super sad story, and then talking to people like Patrick who are like, it's all a hoax, none of it is real. I mean, how do you, in your brain, how do you know the reality of it and then look at the people like Patrick and give them the exact same time of day? Because that's what I tried to do, but it's hard.
Well, I mean, it's first of all, it sounds like you did an awesome job. And I love the fact, Kate, that you were able to trace back sort of where his ideology came from, right? And also trace it back in a way that allows us to sort of empathize with a part of his experience, right? Like that's, this is, I mean, I unfortunately, I guess, although like it's just part and parcel again of the country that we live in. I feel like I write a lot about, you know, uh, extremism, disinformation, hate, conspiracy. Like these things are especially right now in our political moment, they're like alive and well and thriving. It's very easy to and honestly not even wrong to feel so turned off by ideas that are you know at their like most benign, like just like blatantly false and frankly idiotic, or at their worst, like right now in our country, racist, xenophobic, whatever else it might be, right? And I think you have every right as a journalist and a person to say like I don't want to listen to this. At the same time, I think like most people come to these sometimes awful conclusions from places of their own pain, right? Like that's what's at the root oftentimes of how people interpret the world and the stories that they tell themselves. So I think being able to be empathetic enough to take us back to that place of pain, and to make us see somebody as human, somebody who we might not see as fully human. We might just see as like a sort of caricature of disinformation and scientific denial. To make us see that person as human is a real gift, and then maybe helps us challenge our assumptions about other people and what they think, and also hopefully makes us all a little bit more empathetic, and a little slower to dismiss people like whole cloth, very quickly. So I think that's like very important, worthy work. I think it's hard, and I think it's really interesting that you didn't wear a mask, shook his hand. Like I totally get that instinct, and certainly when I'm reporting, it's always my, I want to make people feel comfortable, right? Mostly I want to show to them in whatever way I can, like, hey, I'm not here to judge you. Like I'm not doing journalism out of a place of judgment. If possible, I'm doing it from a place of understanding. Like I'm trying to figure out why do you think this? How'd you conclude this? And I think what sometimes becomes very challenging in stories is like if we, and this is an issue in journalism, I think sometimes now, if we like present everybody's opinions or ideas as like equally possible, like, oh, hey, you can be like, there's, there are good people on both sides, right? Like that kind of idea of like, there's, you can be an anti-racist or you can be a white supremacist. Here are these ideas, everybody choose for themselves. That's not good enough, right? We have to be able to say when things are wrong, and where they come from, and like where we have to be able to sort of uphold the facts and also reveal disinformation for what it is. So I think sometimes the challenge in writing those pieces is to say, this is what this person thinks, but finding a way to also show that it's categorically false while still making us in some ways understand the person and how they came to think that. So I'm curious for you, like in your story, how did you kind of handle that, or were you able to sort of say, these things are not true, but XXX, or kind of how'd you deal with that piece of it?
So when I wrote about what he was saying, and I would write about kind of like his ranting and then, you know, what he believed, why he believed it, and then I would just kind of do a short, like, I mean, what he believes is false. This is actually the science behind why vaccines work, or this is why people wear masks. Or I would be like,
Right.
you know, of course, wearing masks is not about, like, his big thing was like, a virus is so small it can get through a mask. Like, well, it's in the water vapor that's in your, you know, mouth when you breathe out. That's what the mask catches. So
Right.
I would do a short little sentence or two explaining why that was wrong, and then continue on with him and what he was saying, and kind of like I tried to put in as much background as I could.
Yep.
As like I wanted him to be an empathetic character, but at the same time stand firm in my in real factual knowledge. So I was
Yep.
not advocating for what he was saying. I was allowing him to say it.
Yeah, I think it sounds to me like you handled it super well. And also, like, it's important for us to write about, unfortunately, these mindsets, right? Because this is it's not a small number of Americans. It sadly is, 20% of Americans who are still adamant that they will not get vaccinated, and that reality is going to keep all of us in this space for a long time. So that this mindset matters, and it's important to explore it. And it sounds like you did it really well. I mean, I had a challenge, like in this book, because it's an oral history and because it's people narrating their own stories. I had to think really hard about, like, somebody's not going to be telling their own story of disinformation and like spewing their own conspiracy theories and then being like, by the way, I know this isn't right. But so, like, it was like, how do I sort of hold this person accountable? How do I fact check? How do I show that this is, am I just giving this person a microphone? And so that was really hard. And so, what I did for the most part is, I wrote about that mindset through people who then had come to a different place. So, like, one of the stories in the book is also about a guy in Texas. Tony Green was his name. He was like, if not COVID denial, then like serious minimizing of what the virus was. Believed that it was, if not a hoax, then like a totally overblown sort of conspiracy theory. Eventually convinced other people in his family of the same thing. Said, screw this, let's all get together and have a big party at my house. Of course, then a bunch of people got sick. His father-in-law died. Tony ended up in the hospital and had a really bad case of COVID. And his piece ends up being about that mindset, about like going down all those rabbit holes, but then also about sort of the guilt of reconciling that with what happened. So, it sort of is able to explore that while still coming to like a place of fact, I guess. But that was a big challenge in this book. And it sounds like you were able, by reporting the story in the way you did, you could sort of say things as they were and still give his story space. In like an oral history, that was a complicated thing that I had to wrestle with.
Yeah, I love this idea and this thread here of giving voice to our sources, right? And helping them tell the story, but then us kind of serving that role as narrator in some ways, to kind of bring it and elevate it to the really importance that it is. Rebecca, I love your story because you take on this issue of the coronavirus, and you address what traditionally would be a taboo subject, but it's really, you humanized it. So tell us a little bit about Christy.
Yeah, so I actually struggled to come up with ideas for this assignment because I was like, everyone's dealing with COVID burnout. So it was kind of like, well, what hasn't already been talked about, or who hasn't already gotten, had their voices heard. And so I was thinking, I hadn't really heard of OnlyFans until, the pandemic really took off, especially like in March 2020, when everyone didn't know what was going to happen, like what the future was like, whether or not we'd have vaccines and stuff. And then I thought, a lot of dancers probably turn to that platform to make money because can't really follow CDC guidelines in a strip club, to be honest. So I did some searching around on Twitter and like Instagram, looking through hashtags of all these different things, saw a lot of different things, probably more than I wanted to, but I found Christy and I DM'd her. I DM'd several women, but she got back to me pretty quickly. I explained to her, I'm like, hey, I'm a grad student. We're doing this project over COVID and I want to see how it's impacted your work and things like that. And she was really excited. She was really open to talk about it. Whereas most women that I DM'd either left me on red or they would talk to me, like we'd exchange a few messages and then they would just ghost me, which I understand because, you know, there is a stigma that comes with being a dancer and all the things that come with it. And a lot of them wanted to remain anonymous, which I told them we could use their stage name, but I guess, you know, they were still scared, which I understand. Christy actually used to work for her student newspaper in high school. So I think that might have been why she was more willing to talk to me. So the first couple times we met were just on Zoom. We just had some chats, got to know each other. I didn't even record the first time that we talked just so we could, you know, get to know each other and like talk about the story and what I wanted to do, what she wanted to do. And eventually I did go to her club that she danced at just so I could, you know, set the scene and things like that. And that's where she actually really opened up the most. Like I walked in and she was already on stage. So I had to quickly like find a seat and like whip out my notebook and start taking notes and everything. And she came and sat by me afterwards and we talked for a bit. It was a slower night. It wasn't as packed or anything, which was good because, you know, COVID and everything. I, like Kate, I wasn't wearing my mask because I didn't want to be like, make anyone uncomfortable or anything like that. So we sat and talked for a while and then some of her friends came, but eventually, you know, they all went back out onto the floor to try and make money with the few people that are there. But yeah, it was a really different experience. I was definitely outside my comfort zone, which was something I wanted to do. I wanted to do something I wasn't comfortable with just to really grow as a writer. But yeah, she talked about turning to OnlyFans for a while. But she's still in the club. Like I still keep up with her. She's still dancing and everything. She's a single mom, which that was something I didn't really know about. A lot of the dancers were single parents, or maybe they weren't single parents, but they had kids to provide for. And
Right.
it's a way to make a lot of fast money, especially in the Dallas area.
Yeah. I mean, I just I love that story idea. Like in part because it's such I think the responsibility of journalism, I hope, is to sort of find and seek out stories from kind of the hidden corners, and that to me is like a wonderful example of that. Right? It's not when we think about the pandemic and who's impacted, that's like very few people's first instinct. But as soon as you said it, it's like in so many ways. First of all, it's like an incredible manifestation of isolation, right? Like something that's in person suddenly turning to this like transactional, like solitary thing over a screen. And also in terms of like economic impact and people who are impacted and just marginalized groups, like that's like a bullseye in that space. So I'm so glad you paid attention to it. And also like you said with Christy, and like the fact that some women were more hesitant to trust, like it is it's a huge thing to ask of somebody, right? To say to Christy, like, hey, I know you do this thing that a lot of people already judge you for, and I know that right now you're probably at a really hard time in your life because your income and all these other things have just been upended, but do you want to tell that story to a lot of people? Like that's like on the surface, that's like a really that's a hard thing to ask, right? But I think my pitch to people that I want to write about, frankly, is always the same. It's you know, as journalists, we can't really offer people anything, right? We can't ethically offer them money, compensation, even control of their stories, right? I can't say to the people I'm writing about, I'm going to let you see this before it runs, because if I did that, it would in some ways be handing them over editing power of their own story. And none of us are the most fair editors of our own story. So instead, all we can say to people is, hey, I think this matters. I think what's happening to you is important. And I think it's probably happening to a lot of other people too. And maybe if I can sort of make people understand what's happening here, and if I can show it to them, it might change the way they think about people in your situation, and it might change the way they perceive the world around them. That's it. Like you're basically appealing uh to people's sense that their own stories matter in the world. And I do think that also is a powerful thing to offer somebody, right? Like for Christy to have somebody come into her life and say, you matter, like you, like this is, the world maybe has depersonalized you in all of these different ways, but I see you and I see what this situation is, and it looks really hard, and I want to pay attention to it, and I think other people should pay attention to it. That is what a powerful thing to give somebody, to make them feel seen like that. That's I think that's part of what our work can do. So good job. Like that's because that's a place that not very many people are seeing.
Thank you.
Yeah, it sounds awesome, Rebecca.
This has been a wonderful conversation. We've been with Eli Saslow, author of the upcoming book, Voices from the Pandemic. Americans Tell Their Stories of Crisis, Courage, and Resilience. Eli's a Pulitzer Prize winner, a Washington Post reporter, and we've been joined with Megan Martinez, Rebecca Nahara, and Kate Pazzulli, who had a chance to work on this wonderful project for the Mayborn Graduate Institute of Journalism, the Coronavirus Chronicles. And Eli, I've enjoyed this conversation. And any closing tips or advice that you'd have for those attending the conference, for our students, for other aspiring writers who are going about telling and reporting these kinds of stories? Because I think you pointed to a little earlier that this is a story that's going to continue to evolve.
Yeah.
The impact of this pandemic is going to be, obviously it's been going to be lifelong for many people, but I think for society, for politics, for journalism, for medical care, all of these things are going to be redefined, the future pandemics and how we address them. Any closing advice and tips on how we best tell these stories?
Well, I mean, many things come to mind because the challenges are so big, right? Like it's, and I would say, the challenges also to aspiring journalists sometimes can feel big. And the one thing that I would say for myself that has helped me and sustained me is finding a way, sometimes, only for myself, to do stories that I care about. Like all of us, we want to be journalists. Like if we wanted to make a lot of money or do whatever other things, we would have picked different jobs. People do this kind of work because they care and they want to do work that matters to them. And so I would say, try to find ways, even if sometimes like it's on your own time and you don't know who's reading them, or it takes pushing your editors, find ways to do stories that are the kind of stories that made you want to get into this work in the first place. Because those, for me, are the stories that have made me last in this job. I mean, at first, my jobs in journalism were I was covering high school volleyball for the Washington Post, and if I was just doing those stories for 3 years, like on deadline, writing 400 words again and again, I wouldn't have lasted. Like I would have gone to do something else. So, doing like these sort of more narrative stories for me began from a place of like, I need to do a story that I care about, and even if nobody's assigning me that story, or I don't know where that story is going to be published, like I have to do these stories that made me want to do this kind of work. And going along with that, I would say, sometimes journalists, as we think about what our jobs are, there's sort of this idea, at least there was at Syracuse where I went to school, that like you should take your own feelings and your own sort of empathy and humanity out of the process, right? Like you just go in as a blank slate, and you're not supposed to necessarily feel things, and you write from a place of some remove, and I think that if there was ever that moment, it's not now. Like the stories, if you want to write something that's going to make the reader feel something and care about something, you better feel something, right? Like go follow your instincts and go to the places that you're curious about, that you care about, that are going to move you. Because I think it's the stories that move you that are also going to ultimately impact the people who are reading them, right? And that doesn't mean that you're writing them from a place of activism or anything like that. It means that you are going to find people and to put yourself in situations that are going to make you feel something, because that's the only way that you're going to make readers feel anything for the people that you're writing about.
Thank you, Eli. That really is a wonderful closing remarks. Thanks for your time, Megan, Rebecca, Kate. Thanks for joining us for this great conversation. I think we could go on and on to unpack so many of the other stories. So we'll have to have a part 2 at some point. But thanks for joining us for this year's Mayborn Literary Nonfiction Conference and the Mayborn Lit Conversation podcast.
Thanks, everybody. Really appreciate it. And thanks so much to all of you at Mayborn for what you do in supporting and creating a platform for this kind of work. And in addition to creating journalists who are now so good at doing it.